TTU Hannibal Barca, TTS Ready Voice over Script. Victory can be more dangerous than defeat. What happens when your greatest triumph makes you too powerful for your own allies to trust? The story I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about loyalty, genius, and the price of being unstoppable. Meet Hannibal Barca, the military genius who took elephants across the Alps and crushed the mighty Roman Empire at its own game. He won every major battle he fought. Roman mothers scared their children with his name. European generals still study his tactics 2,000 years later. But when this unstoppable warrior finally met his end, it wasn't Roman swords that killed him. It was poison, delivered by the very people he had spent his life trying to protect. The man who could defeat any enemy in battle was destroyed by allies who feared his power more than they valued his protection. How does the greatest military mind in ancient history end up betrayed by his own side? This goes beyond ancient warfare or political intrigue. This is about what happens when someone becomes so successful that even their friends see them as a threat. When your victories make you more dangerous to your allies than your enemies are to them. When this story ends, you'll understand how military genius can become a political liability, and how the same qualities that make someone a great protector can make them impossible to trust. Transport yourself to 3rd century BC North Africa. The Mediterranean world is dominated by two superpowers locked in a death struggle. Rome controls Italy and is expanding across the known world with ruthless efficiency. Carthage, based in modern-day Tunisia, controls crucial trade routes and commands wealth that makes Roman senators jealous. These aren't just competing nations. They're fundamentally different civilizations. Rome builds its power through military conquest and political domination. Carthage creates wealth through trade networks and diplomatic alliances. But Rome's expansion threatens everything Carthage has built. Roman legions are systematically destroying Carthaginian influence across the Mediterranean. Trade routes that have existed for centuries are being seized by Roman merchants backed by Roman swords. War between these powers is inevitable. What nobody expects is that this war will produce the greatest military genius the ancient world has ever seen. In 218 BC, a 29-year-old Carthaginian general makes a decision that will change the course of Western civilization. Instead of waiting for Roman armies to attack Carthage, Hannibal Barca chooses to do the impossible: march an entire army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps to attack Rome on its home territory. This isn't just bold, it's insane. The Alps are a frozen death trap where entire armies have vanished without a trace. No one has ever successfully crossed them with elephants. Military experts consider the plan suicide, but Hannibal pulls it off. Against all odds, he emerges in northern Italy with a force that will terrorize Rome for the next 16 years. What follows will be a masterclass in military strategy that reshapes how warfare is fought forever. But it will also set in motion the tragic events that ultimately destroy both Hannibal and the civilization he fought to protect. Hannibal's war against Rome didn't begin with military strategy. It started with a promise made by a 9-year-old boy to his dying father. Hannibal Barca, one of Carthage's greatest generals, had spent his life fighting Roman expansion. On his deathbed, he made his young son swear an oath that would define the rest of ancient history. "Promise me," Hamilcar whispered, "that you will never be Rome's friend." Young Hannibal placed his small hand on the sacred altar and spoke words that would echo through centuries. "I swear eternal hatred against Rome." Most childhood promises are forgotten. This one would reshape the Mediterranean world. While Roman boys played with wooden swords in their courtyards, Hannibal was receiving the finest military education money could buy. Carthage sent their most promising young nobles to study with Greek tacticians, Persian cavalry specialists, and Numidian scouts who could track enemies across desert terrain. But Hannibal's education went beyond traditional military training. His father had recognized something special in the boy, an ability to see battlefield situations with perfect clarity and find solutions that other commanders missed entirely. By age 18, Hannibal was commanding cavalry units in Spain. By 25, he was leading entire military campaigns. Veteran soldiers twice his age followed his orders without question because his tactical decisions kept them alive and brought them victory. When Hannibal became supreme commander of Carthaginian forces in 221 BC, Rome initially dismissed him as another young noble playing at war. This was their first major mistake in a conflict that would be defined by Roman miscalculations. Hannibal spent his first years in command doing something that seemed impossibly boring to outside observers. He studied Roman military tactics with obsessive intensity. While other generals focused on their own strategies, Hannibal was learning everything possible about how Roman legions fought, moved, and thought. He interrogated prisoners extensively, not for information about troop movements, but to understand Roman military culture. He analyzed captured equipment to learn about Roman manufacturing and supply systems. He even learned Latin so he could understand intercepted Roman communications. This wasn't just preparation, it was the foundation of genius. In 218 BC, Hannibal faced a choice that would define his legacy forever. Roman armies were preparing to invade Carthaginian territory in both Spain and North Africa. Traditional military wisdom suggested that Carthage should prepare defensive positions and wait for Roman attacks. Hannibal chose the opposite approach. Instead of defending Carthaginian territory, he would attack Roman territory. Instead of fighting where Romans expected, he would strike where they considered themselves completely safe. The plan he developed was so audacious that his own generals initially thought he was joking. Hannibal would march an army from Spain, across southern France, over the Alps, and into northern Italy, bringing the war directly to Rome's heartland. Military historians still debate whether this was brilliant strategy or elaborate suicide. What Hannibal accomplished during his Alpine crossing remains one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. He moved 90,000 soldiers, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants across mountain terrain that defeated most experienced travelers. The challenges were beyond anything modern people can easily comprehend. Alpine passes in November are death traps where temperatures drop far below freezing without warning. Avalanches can bury entire armies in minutes. Local tribes attack supply columns and vanish into terrain they know intimately. Hannibal lost nearly half his army during the crossing, but what he accomplished was revolutionary. When Roman scouts reported that Carthaginian forces were descending into the Po Valley, Roman generals refused to believe the reports. The idea of elephants in northern Italy seemed too absurd for serious consideration. Hannibal's first battles in Italy revealed the full extent of his tactical genius. At the Battle of Trebia River in December 218 BC, he demonstrated an understanding of Roman psychology that was almost supernatural. Roman generals were aggressive and confident, qualities that had served them well in previous conflicts. Hannibal turned these strengths into weaknesses by creating battlefield situations where Roman aggression became a liability. He used fake retreats to draw Roman forces into carefully prepared killing zones. He employed Numidian cavalry to harass Roman formations until they lost cohesion. Most brilliantly, he studied Roman command structures and created tactical situations that exploited their decision-making processes. Roman legions that had conquered most of the known world found themselves outmaneuvered by strategies they had never encountered. But Hannibal's greatest weapon wasn't tactical. It was psychological. He understood that Rome's power depended on the myth of Roman invincibility. If he could shatter that myth, Rome's Italian allies might switch sides and join Carthage. Every victory Hannibal won sent shockwaves through Roman society. Citizens who had never doubted Roman military supremacy suddenly found themselves wondering whether their legions could be defeated by a foreign general. More dangerously for Rome, Italian city-states that had been forced into Roman alliances began calculating whether Carthaginian friendship might be preferable to Roman domination. Throughout these early victories, Hannibal maintained close communication with Carthage's ruling council. His military success was exactly what Carthaginian politicians had hoped for. Roman attention was focused on defending Italy rather than attacking Carthaginian territories. The relationship between Hannibal and his political superiors seemed ideal. He provided military victories that protected Carthaginian interests. They provided supplies, reinforcements, and diplomatic support that kept his campaigns operational. Neither side realized that this success was creating the conditions for a tragedy that would destroy both Hannibal and Carthage itself. As news of Hannibal's victories spread across the Mediterranean world, something subtle but dangerous began happening in Carthage. Politicians who had initially celebrated their general's success began to worry about the implications of having such a powerful military commander operating independently in foreign territory. August 2nd, 216 BC. The Battle of Cannae became the most studied military engagement in Western history. Hannibal faced a Roman army twice the size of his own force, commanded by experienced generals on terrain that favored Roman tactics. What happened next defied every expectation of ancient warfare. Hannibal executed a tactical maneuver so perfect that military academies still teach it today. The double envelopment, or pincer movement, that trapped an entire Roman army in a killing zone of Carthaginian design. In a single afternoon, Hannibal's forces killed approximately 70,000 Roman soldiers, including 80 senators, 29 military tribunes, and hundreds of Roman nobles. It was the worst military disaster in Roman history, worse than any defeat they would suffer for the next 600 years. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the casualties. Rome, which had considered itself invincible, discovered that its legions could be not just defeated, but utterly annihilated by superior strategy and tactics. Cannae revealed the full scope of Hannibal's military genius. He had studied Roman psychology, Roman tactics, and Roman leadership so thoroughly that he could predict their responses with almost perfect accuracy. Roman generals were trained to seek decisive battles where superior numbers and discipline would triumph. Hannibal gave them exactly the kind of battle they wanted, then used their own aggressive instincts to destroy them. He positioned his weakest troops in the center of his formation, allowing Romans to push them back and believe they were winning. Meanwhile, his strongest forces on the flanks waited for the perfect moment to close the trap. The maneuver required perfect timing, absolute discipline, and complete confidence from every soldier in the Carthaginian army. One mistake, one moment of panic, and the entire formation would collapse. Instead, Hannibal achieved tactical perfection that has never been equaled in Western military history. News of Cannae reached Rome and created panic unlike anything the city had ever experienced. Citizens who had never doubted Roman superiority suddenly found themselves wondering whether Hannibal might actually march on Rome itself. The Roman Senate, which had been debating aggressive strategies just days earlier, now faced the possibility of complete military collapse. Italian allies who had been forced into Roman alliances began switching sides, calculating that Carthaginian protection was preferable to Roman revenge. For the first time in centuries, Romans experienced what their enemies had always felt: the terror of facing an apparently unstoppable military force led by a genius who seemed to understand their weaknesses better than they understood them themselves. Hannibal had achieved something no foreign general had accomplished in over 200 years. He had made Rome afraid. While Romans panicked, Carthaginian politicians in North Africa began making calculations that would ultimately destroy their greatest general. Hannibal's victories were protecting Carthaginian interests exactly as planned, but his success was creating new problems that nobody had anticipated. The young general had become more famous and more feared than the Carthaginian state itself. Foreign diplomats seeking alliances with Carthage increasingly focused on relationships with Hannibal rather than with Carthaginian political authorities. More dangerously, Hannibal's military success was making him wealthy and influential in ways that threatened traditional Carthaginian power structures. His soldiers were fanatically loyal to him personally rather than to Carthage as a state. Carthaginian nobles began to realize that they might have created a monster, a military genius whose power and independence could eventually challenge their own authority. Starting around 215 BC, Carthaginian support for Hannibal's campaigns began to change in subtle but crucial ways. Promised reinforcements arrived late or not at all. Supply shipments that should have contained weapons and food instead carried luxury goods that generated profits for Carthaginian merchants but didn't help Hannibal's military situation. Most devastatingly, Carthage began redirecting military resources to other theaters of operation, claiming that threats in Spain and North Africa required attention that might otherwise support Hannibal's Italian campaigns. These decisions were presented as necessary responses to changing strategic circumstances. In reality, they represented a calculated effort to limit Hannibal's power and independence. The politicians who had celebrated his early victories were now actively undermining his ability to achieve final victory over Rome. Hannibal found himself fighting a two-front war, against Roman armies in Italy and against political sabotage from his own government in Carthage. Roman forces, reorganized under new leadership, began avoiding the kind of decisive battles where Hannibal's tactical genius gave him overwhelming advantages. Instead, they adopted what became known as Fabian tactics, named after the Roman general Fabius, who refused to fight Hannibal directly and instead focused on attacking his supply lines, isolating his forces, and gradually wearing down Carthaginian strength through attrition. This strategy was less glorious than the direct confrontations that had led to Roman disasters, but it was more effective against a general whose brilliance was most dangerous in conventional battles. Meanwhile, Hannibal's requests for reinforcements and supplies were met with increasingly creative excuses from Carthaginian authorities who were more concerned about his growing independence than about Roman military recovery. By 210 BC, Hannibal controlled most of southern Italy but found himself increasingly isolated. His original army of North African and Spanish veterans was aging and couldn't be replaced. His Italian allies provided local support but lacked the training and equipment needed for major military operations. Most crucially, he lacked the siege equipment necessary to attack Rome itself. Taking the Roman capital would require massive engineering resources that only Carthage could provide, and Carthage was systematically refusing to provide them. Hannibal began to realize that his political masters preferred a situation where he remained a threat to Rome, but never became powerful enough to challenge Carthaginian authority. They wanted him to be successful enough to protect Carthaginian interests, but not so successful that he could dictate Carthaginian policy. As Roman resistance stiffened and Carthaginian support weakened, Hannibal's military situation became increasingly desperate. The general, who had terrorized Rome for over a decade, found himself unable to achieve the decisive victory that would end the war on favorable terms. Carthaginian politicians, meanwhile, began exploring diplomatic solutions that would end the conflict without requiring them to support Hannibal's continued military operations. Secret negotiations with Roman representatives focused on peace terms that would preserve Carthaginian commercial interests while abandoning territorial claims in Italy. These discussions deliberately excluded Hannibal, whose military reputation made him a non-negotiable obstacle to Roman acceptance of any peace agreement. Carthaginian negotiators began treating their greatest general as a liability to be managed rather than an asset to be supported. In 203 BC, after 16 years of campaigning in Italy, Hannibal received orders that ended his military career and began his final tragedy. The Carthaginian government, facing a Roman invasion of North Africa led by Scipio Africanus, commanded their general to abandon his Italian campaigns and return home to defend Carthage itself. The recall was presented as a necessary response to immediate military threats. In reality, it represented the culmination of years of political maneuvering designed to limit Hannibal's power and independence. By forcing him to abandon his position in Italy, Carthaginian politicians were ensuring that his military achievements would be incomplete and that his political influence would be constrained within traditional Carthaginian power structures. Hannibal's return to North Africa led inevitably to the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. his first and only major defeat. Facing Scipio Africanus, a Roman general who had studied Hannibal's tactics as carefully as Hannibal had once studied Roman methods, the Carthaginian commander found himself outmaneuvered for the first time in his career. The defeat wasn't just military, it was symbolic. The man who had terrorized Rome for nearly 2 decades was finally beaten by Roman forces using adapted versions of his own tactical innovations. More tragically, Hannibal fought this crucial battle with inadequate support from his own government. The Carthaginian forces under his command lacked the quality and cohesion of his original army and included many troops who had been kept from joining his earlier campaigns by political decisions in Carthage. The general, who might have conquered Rome with proper support, instead suffered defeat because his own allies feared his success more than they valued victory over their enemies. The Treaty of Zama in 201 BC officially ended the Second Punic War, but it also sealed Hannibal's fate in ways that went far beyond military defeat. Rome's peace terms weren't just harsh, they were specifically designed to eliminate Carthaginian military power forever. Carthage was forced to surrender its entire navy except for 10 ceremonial ships. The war elephants that had terrorized Roman armies were killed or given to Rome. Most crucially, Carthage was forbidden from waging war without Roman permission, effectively making it a Roman client state. These terms meant that Hannibal, the greatest military genius of his age, was now a general without the possibility of commanding armies. His entire life's work, protecting Carthaginian independence through military excellence, had been rendered meaningless by political decisions made by the very people he had fought to protect. Faced with the collapse of Carthaginian military power, Hannibal made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of retiring into obscurity or seeking exile, he chose to enter Carthaginian politics directly. In 196 BC, he was elected as one of Carthage's chief magistrates, a position that gave him authority over civilian administration and economic policy. For the first time in his life, Hannibal was fighting battles with words and laws instead of swords and tactics. His political reforms were as brilliant as his military strategies had been. He restructured Carthaginian tax collection, eliminated corruption in government contracts, and reorganized trade relationships in ways that restored much of Carthage's commercial prosperity. Within just a few years, Hannibal had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had made Carthage wealthy and influential again, despite the military restrictions imposed by Rome. But Hannibal's political success created the same problems that his military genius had generated years earlier. Carthaginian nobles who had initially supported his reforms began to worry about the implications of having such an effective leader in civilian authority. More dangerously, Roman politicians became alarmed by reports of Carthaginian economic recovery under Hannibal's leadership. The peace treaty had been designed to keep Carthage weak and dependent. Hannibal's reforms threatened to restore Carthaginian independence through economic rather than military means. Roman senators began demanding that Carthage remove Hannibal from political office, claiming that his presence in government violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace agreement. Faced with Roman pressure and their own fears about Hannibal's growing influence, Carthaginian politicians made the decision that would complete their general's tragedy. In 195 BC, they informed Roman authorities that they would cooperate in efforts to remove Hannibal from power permanently. The man who had spent his entire life protecting Carthaginian independence was now considered too dangerous to remain in Carthaginian territory. His own government, the same political system he had fought to preserve, had decided that appeasing Rome was more important than protecting their greatest citizen. Secret messages were sent to Roman commanders, providing information about Hannibal's movements and plans. The betrayal that had begun with military sabotage 15 years earlier was now complete. Carthage was actively cooperating in the destruction of the man who had sacrificed everything for their protection. Realizing that his own people had turned against him, Hannibal fled Carthage in 195 BC and began a 20-year exile that took him across the Mediterranean world. He served as a military advisor to various kingdoms that opposed Roman expansion, always hoping to find a power capable of challenging Rome's growing dominance. But everywhere he went, Roman influence followed. Kings who initially welcomed the famous general soon received diplomatic pressure from Rome, demanding that they surrender their dangerous guest. One by one, Hannibal's refugees disappeared, as Roman political pressure made his presence a liability for any potential ally. In 183 BC, Hannibal found himself in the kingdom of Bithynia, serving as an advisor to King Prusias. Roman forces, led by the general Flamininus, arrived with demands for Hannibal's surrender. King Prusias, like so many others before him, chose Roman friendship over loyalty to his guest. Hannibal, now 64 years old and exhausted by decades of exile, realized that he had finally run out of places to hide. The man who had spent his entire life fighting Rome would never be allowed to live peacefully anywhere in the Roman sphere of influence. Rather than face capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Roman streets as a trophy, Hannibal made his final tactical decision. He swallowed poison that he had carried in a ring for years, prepared for exactly this moment. His last words, according to historical accounts, were addressed to the Romans who had pursued him relentlessly. "Let us free the Romans from their long anxiety, since they find it too long to wait for an old man's death." Even in death, Hannibal demonstrated the bitter wit that had characterized his entire tragic career. Hannibal Barca's story reveals one of history's cruelest ironies. Sometimes being too good at what you do becomes your greatest weakness. He was arguably the finest military strategist who ever lived, but his very excellence made him too dangerous for his own allies to trust. His tactical innovations changed warfare forever. The pincer movements he perfected at Cannae are still taught in military academies worldwide. His logistics achievements, moving an army across the Alps, remain among the greatest organizational feats in human history. Yet none of these accomplishments could protect him from the political consequences of his own success. The same brilliance that terrorized Rome ultimately terrified Carthage, leading to the betrayal that defined his final decades. Hannibal's tragedy wasn't just personal, it was civilizational. Carthage's decision to undermine their greatest general rather than support him fully may have cost them their independence forever. With proper support, Hannibal might have conquered Rome and changed the entire course of Western civilization. Instead, Carthaginian fears about his power led to half measures and sabotage that ensured both his defeat and their own destruction. Within 50 years of Hannibal's death, Rome would destroy Carthage completely in the Third Punic War. The civilization that had betrayed its greatest protector was ultimately eliminated by the enemy he had fought his entire life to defeat. Hannibal's story resonates powerfully in our contemporary world. We see similar dynamics whenever exceptional individuals become so successful that their organizations view them as threats rather than assets. Corporate leaders who transform companies but become too independent for boards to control. Military officers whose victories make politicians nervous about their ambitions. Artists and innovators whose success changes entire industries but makes established powers uncomfortable. The pattern repeats itself across different contexts. Excellence that should be celebrated instead becomes dangerous, and the very people who benefit from someone's achievements end up destroying them out of fear. Could Hannibal's tragedy have been avoided? If Carthaginian politicians had trusted their general and provided full support for his campaigns, would the outcome have been different? We'll never know, but the historical evidence suggests that half-hearted support for exceptional individuals often produces worse outcomes than no support at all. Carthage's attempt to limit Hannibal's power while still benefiting from his success created the worst possible situation. They neither won their war nor controlled their general. Hannibal's story teaches us uncomfortable truths about the relationship between talent and power. Exceptional individuals often require exceptional trust and support to achieve their full potential. Organizations that try to benefit from genius while controlling it often end up destroying both the genius and themselves. Sometimes the only choice is between full commitment to exceptional people or complete separation from them. The man who could outthink Roman generals, cross impossible mountain ranges, and revolutionize military tactics couldn't solve the fundamental problem of political trust. His greatest enemy wasn't Roman legions. It was the fear he inspired in people who should have been his strongest allies. If this tale of military genius and political betrayal moved you, subscribe for more stories about exceptional individuals whose talents became their downfall. What other historical figures were destroyed not by their enemies, but by their own success. Share your thoughts. Could Carthage have supported Hannibal fully without risking their own political system? And what does his story teach us about managing exceptional talent in our own organizations? Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't failing. It's succeeding so completely that success itself becomes impossible to survive.